In addition to simply identifying mammals and their physical characteristics, it's usually more likely that you're going to find signs of mammal activity as opposed to actually seeing the actual mammal. That's because, of course, a lot of them are designed to blend into the environment. That's also because they're highly on the move and they might have a life history, for example, being nocturnal, where you don't see them out when you might be out looking for them. So there are many things and why we are going to spend a little bit of time focusing on mammal signs. So that includes things like tracks and scat and feeding activity, markings, nests and burrows, and artifacts that are left behind by our mammals, which can in fact identify for a good portion not only the species but also in fact potentially the numbers of animals or mammals that were there. Scat is one of the more reliable indicators of signs. The size and the shape, for example, you can, in a lot of cases, visually identify the species, or at least the family of species that it was left behind by. But of course, you can tell other things by it. So the contents, what has it been eating? The color and consistency, how old is it? Where is it? Territory markings, etc. So scat can be a variety of different things. You can also get more conclusive results about species by actually doing genetic analysis of some of the sloughed off intestinal cells left behind from the animal. So you could identify genetically also what the scat is. Also hormone analysis as well. So looking at things like cortisol or testosterone or estrogen or any of these other long-term hormones, you can gauge a lot of information by just analyzing scat samples that are left behind. This is a very helpful diagram because one of the things it does is very clearly shows across mammals of North America not only the size but also the shape and texture variability that you'll see across different species. So looking at things like, for example, in the middle of the image, the gray wolf, a very large scat, lots of fur contained in contents, of course, indicating that it's a carnivore, large, of course, animal, significantly larger than the coyote, which you can see. Similar shape, it's that canid structure like the fox just below it, but of course those are much smaller scat samples than the wolf because of course they're smaller animals. So you can get at some of the size and relationships between animals just by looking at the scat itself. So things like river otter down on the left side contains lots of shelled creatures indicative that it's certainly an aquatic animal. That could be versus the pellet forms of say a deer or larger ones being a moose or mountain goat. So you can tell a lot not only about size and contents, but also the species potentially identifying itself. Some scat, though, can be a little bit confusing. So these are two of the most, I would say, highly confused species in terms of their scat. White-tailed deer and eastern cottontails do both produce pellets, and you can actually see that the pellets are roughly in the same size. Slightly different shape, oval of the white-tailed deer versus more round of the eastern cottontail. Notice though that the species are of course entirely different. The white-tailed deer of course is much larger than the eastern cottontail, yet the scat produced is relatively the same size. So in some cases it can get trickier when you're comparing similar uh, shapes and sizes. But by and large, scat is still, once you get familiar with looking at it, a much reliable tool that's highly used in the field. Feeding activity is also important as well. So not only will animals in some cases leave behind scat, but they'll leave behind evidence that they were there in other ways. For example, a cut down tree from a beaver or a beaver dam, right? These are things that again are indicative of past activity. Woodpeckers, for example, pecking at trees or sapsuckers, or porcupines chewing or gnawing of materials. These are all things that are indicative of certain types of species, which we can then look at by bite and chew marks to see if we can identify at a species or family level. The way that animals bite and chew, of course, is relative to their dental structure and formation. So, for example, a beaver and a porcupine will have different feeding patterns and bite marks and chew marks, and of course, different places where they will bite and chew on the tree. So, sticks and branches will be covered at animal markings at many times. Some animals will peel bark off, right? Some animals will chew the tree. So, understanding what part of the tree what are the teeth marks and also how frequently we'll be able to be narrowing the gap in terms of identification of some of these species. For example, twigs that are eaten by deer are usually entirely ripped off from the bush and leaving behind torn edges that are rough and irregular. So all of these pictures here have been gnawed on by deer. So you can see how irregular and really how damaging they are to shrubs and to low-hanging trees. Now you can appreciate the differences. The rough and irregular deer, which is pictured here, contrasted with the very smooth bite marks and very precise extraction of material of the rabbit. So you can see here, even by looking at twigs and bite marks, you can actually get an idea of what kind of species did the actual eating of the twig. So porcupines, for example, are after the bark. So you can see here the teeth marks, but this is obviously not, of course, a beaver chewing down this tree because they would have a different purpose for it altogether. But the porcupine here is, of course, interested in the bark, not the substrate behind. So again, looking at what and where and how deep the bites are going gives you an idea of what kind of species did the feeding. Another type of markings that we might see are territorial markings, so non-feeding markings. Ungulates, for example, will rub and scrape. Bears will scrape trees to mark them, which you can see here as well in the bottom. Scent, urine, right? All of these sort of territorial markings can be used as evidence or at least pointing to a couple of species identifications or family groups. Lodgings, of course, are evidence of signs left behind. So beaver dams, for example, tree squirrel nests, burrows of varying sizes, and the placement of those burrows, right? A mole versus, say, a badger will have a different size and a different shape. So again, there are all different ways we can use lodges, houses, nests, dens, and cavities to point towards a species that would be living there in that area. Even those species that don't create lodges or nests, even using sleeping areas can be in some ways indicative of what animal has been there. So some species will have beds, a consistent sleeping place where they will go night after night to rest. That, of course, will produce patterns in the ground that you can find. Transit beds, of course, are used as well as part of migration patterns, lays, once or twice, dens where we can raise young. So there are all different kinds of sleeping areas that can also be used in some ways to determine what kind of animal was present in that area. And in sometimes you will find artifacts left behind. So parts of an animal, for example, that have been shed, or if the animal has been killed or has died, will be left behind. So they could be bones, skulls, and this ties well into our skull identification lecture. Things that you will, of course, not degrade, so bone, etc. So again, we would be looking for antlers, indicative of past areas where these species were present. There are certain places where you are likely to find tracks more than others, right? You will find tracks of animals where they are close to food sources or water sources, where they shelter or where they have their sleeping places or dens or lodges, where there is space around for them to, do their territorial markings or wherever they will be. So there is a science about where you will be more likely to find tracks versus not. And of course, once you find tracks, you will then, of course, be able to follow them and find, patterns and where that animal is going and what it's doing. Thinking about where you are likely to find the combination of food and water and shelter and space, etc., some of the good areas to look for tracks are things like forest edges, beside streams, where two habitats meet, say a transitional from a forest to a meadow, old beaver houses or beaver ponds, right? Sandy areas where you're going to see remnants of tracks for longer periods of time, or in clay environments or silty environments in wet times of the year where the clay will make a more firm footprint. So there's lots of places where you will find or more likely to find tracks of animals. Now animals like humans, of course, will use a track over and over again. So animal highways exist, and of course, why wouldn't you? Because it's a whole lot less effort to go through, for example, the snow in already existing tracks than it would be to forge a new track every time. So these are usually species non-specific. Multiple species will be traveling down the same pattern through the forest, through the snow. Larger species will create trails for smaller species, etc. They're frequently used, rarely changed. Animals will get to know them intimately with scents and markers down the road, eventually forming troughs where you've beaten down the vegetation or battered it down so that you can clearly and easily find the track in question. Usually the best time to practice your tracking is in the winter, where you've got fresh snow and you're able to conduct a reliable field survey to detect the presence of a particular species. And the great thing about tracks is that of course the animal was there and you can follow it to where the animal is going. So tracks can be used in a number of different studies, recreational or fur harvesting. There's a lot of different reasons why tracking would be done, for interest, for leisure as well. So there's a lot of rationale for understanding, or at least having an appreciation of how to key out what a track is and what it can be used for. And what kind of things are we using when we identify that track maker? Well, we're looking for things like a gait, their registry, how they're actually impressing onto the ground or the snow. The toes and claws, so how are they shaped? What do they form? What are their sizes and shapes? What habitat they're in? That habitat alone will help narrow down what kinds of mammals you will expect to find in that given context. So if it's close to a beaver den, of course you'd be looking for that. Close to a bear den, you'd be looking for that. So again, there are all different ways in which you can use not only the track itself, but the habitat and the context to determine or get an idea of what species was there. Within our gait patterns, so gait is, of course, how they move, there are basically four different types. You can have a waddler or a pacer. You can have an alternator, also called a diagonaler. You can have a bounder, or you can have a galloper. So animals that pace are called waddlers. These are the wide-bodied, slow-moving animals like bears and beavers and raccoons who do, in fact, waddle along as they move. Alternators use an alternating stepping pattern, so they will move with alternate legs going forward and backwards. These are things like deer, moose, cats, and dogs. Bounders, they will of course be things like weasels, minks, and fishers. We'll get into them in a minute. Gallopers, mice, squirrels, and hares, right? And then of course there are other, of course, non-mammal tracks, turkeys, grouse, crows, etc., that have a distinctive bird-like movement, which we'll also show you as well. So here are these basic gait patterns. So the pacers or the waddlers. These are our bears as our example. You can see they pace along front and back. Their fore paw basically is right in front of their hind paw as they move backwards and forwards as they move their feet. The diagonal or the alternating step pattern, you can see they are in fact alternating, and you can see that the hind foot goes directly behind the front foot. So it's different than the pacer because you can see that they are very close in proximity. A bounder, what's distinctive about them is when they are bounding, their hind foot and their front foot, of course, are in close proximity and almost side by side. A galloper is different. The hind foot and the forefoot, yes, they are, they're in front of one another, but you can see they're separate and they have a very distinct pattern of where the hind foot and the forefoot actually lands as they go. These are the four basic gait patterns. There are slight differences across species, but this is how you would assign most mammal species into one of these patterns. So let's take a few minutes and go through all of these patterns in a little bit more detail. We'll start with the alternating or diagonal walkers. These are cats and dogs, ungulates, so deer, etc. The opposite limbs move at the same time. The rear right foot lands on top but slightly behind where the front right foot was a moment earlier, so you saw that in the diagram below. Foxes and cats will typically step directly into their footprint, direct register, while some are less precise. So again, the front feet of diagonal walkers are usually considerably larger than their rear feet. So again, this is something that we use when we're assigning and looking at how the tracks actually occur within the snow or within the soft mud. And now for those pacelers or waddlers. Those are these wide-bodied, slow-moving animals, remember? Skunks, muskrats, beavers, porcupines, bears, raccoons, etc. They waddle along, shifting their body weight from side to side, depending on which, of course, foot is in contact with the ground. The legs on one side of the animal move together, and they lumber along, alternating with the legs on the other side. To look at it, the pattern of their gait is the most irregular of all of the four types. It is scattered, right? There's very little pattern because, of course, depending on the speed, the distance between the tracks will be very different. They're usually large, soft, padded feet, which are unique, which you can see the claw marks in some cases, which is one of the good indicators for species identification. One of the things to keep in mind is that the rear feet of many of these animals look very similar in some cases to human feet, with a long and narrow elongated heel, as you can see present in this image. So of course the digits are very different, but the actual heel pattern, it can be quite similar and can be confused. And for those animals that follow the bounding pattern, so the weasel family, like the ermine, the short-tailed weasel, long-tailed weasel, fisher, mink, least weasel, marten, these animals are characterized by having a very elongated body, relatively short legs, and so the most effective way for these animals to move is by bounding, where you can see that their front legs and their back legs follow a very distinct pattern, one in front of the other, and they quite literally bound as they move forward down down their path and down their gait. So because they're bounding together and limbs are in constant motion, they have a very regular pattern, as you can see. So as they move, you'll see that the two front feet will land first, followed by the rear feet, right? And just behind the front. Some overlapping tracks will take place depending on the speed, but that is, generally speaking, a very regular pattern of front followed by back as they move down their pattern. So to illustrate this a little bit easier, we've got a diagram here that shows the pattern. They push off with their back feet, land on their front feet, as you can see in the diagram. Then the front feet land together, followed by the rear feet, right? And then the rear feet land even behind the front feet, and then they bound again. So the track pattern is extremely square and generally rectangular, as you can see here. And now for our final group of animals, our gallopers. These are for things that will jump and hop, like rabbits, squirrels, hares, and mice. What's interesting about this group is the huge discrepancy between the size of their front feet and their hind feet. So in this group, it's quite easy to tell, looking even at a snowshoe hare's track, which are the rear feet and which are the front feet. And by understanding that, the pattern of the gallop becomes quite easy to understand. So to visualize how this happens, of course, the gallopers will push off with their rear feet in a bound. They will land on their front feet. The rear feet will land even and even ahead of the front feet. So if you can see here with our little squirrel, the front feet land uneven, and those are land dwellers. The front feet land even, those are tree dwellers, right? So that's a little tip just to get that in case there. They prefer to gallop, but they will bound if they're in snow or mud, where they actually have to leap out of the environment. So this is diagram here with you see with the squirrel. So they'll push off with their back feet, land on their front. Rear feet come in front of, or just slightly in front of the forefeet, and then they bound off again.